In the middle of 1941, as the war moved eastward, a completely different phase began. It was no longer about isolating, displacing, or punishing. The state machinery began systematically executing entire populations. The orders came from the top. Hitler had clearly expressed what he wanted, to erase the Jews from Europe without leaving a trace. The executions were no longer isolated incidents. They became part of a system involving different levels of the government, the army, and the police. Millions were murdered without trial, without record, without any chance of escape. Trains full of people departed every day towards sealed destinations, while special centers were adapted to make bodies disappear without leaving evidence. The decision was implemented with precision. Each unit knew its role. Justifications were never needed. It was enough to know who had to be eliminated. Hitler's hatred was not a momentary impulse. It was a sustained policy. Each step was part of an already defined plan. At what point was the line drawn that transformed that hatred into a decision of extermination? When fear becomes doctrine, the anti-Semitism Hitler learned in Vienna. When he left Linz, Adolf Hitler moved to Vienna with the idea of dedicating himself to painting. He had already failed in 2 attempts to enter the art academy, which left him with minimal income. During that period, he lived in various public shelters, surrounded by unemployed people, the sick, or those in very precarious situations. That stage marked the beginning of his isolation, during which he spent his time reading pamphlets, newspapers, and political texts. It was there that he began to absorb anti-Jewish ideas that circulated freely in Vienna. In the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, rejection of the Jews was spoken openly. It appeared in speeches, media, and even electoral campaigns. One of the most influential figures was the mayor Karl Lueger, who used anti-Semitic phrases to win over the public. Lueger not only allowed verbal attacks against the Jews, but used them as a tool to consolidate his power, presenting himself as a representative of the people against a supposed Jewish elite that controlled banks, businesses, and the press. Hitler observed how Lueger gained followers by pointing to the Jews as the culprits of social problems. That way of thinking began to seep into his mind, although at that time he still did not have a clear stance. In Linz, he had shared classes with Jewish youths without showing rejection, but in Vienna, everything began to change. Another name that influenced him without direct contact was Georg von Schönerer, a radical politician who defended German purity and rejected everything that was not Germanic. Hitler never met him, but he read many of his speeches and adopted several of his ideas, especially those that combined extreme nationalism with hatred toward the Jews. Schönerer attacked not only the Jews, but also Catholicism, Slavs, and any group that did not fit into his vision of the German people. That mixture of hatred and national pride left a mark on Hitler. Meanwhile, he tried to survive however he could. He sold postcards painted by himself and accepted odd jobs for food. He spent a lot of time in libraries and cafes reading non-stop. He was especially interested in writings about German history, racial purity, cultural decline, and global conspiracies. Though he was still unknown, his worldview was taking shape, nourished by the most extreme ideas of the Viennese environment. In the shelters where he spent the nights, Hitler lived with desperate men, many of them filled with rage against the system. He listened to all kinds of theories blaming the Jews for the economy, the media, and cultural decline. These ideas were not debated, they were repeated as certainties. In that atmosphere, Hitler began to see the Jews as a uniform group guilty of everything. Sensationalist press was also key. Low-cost newspapers filled their front pages with messages of hatred, exaggerated illustrations, and texts accusing the Jews of manipulating society. Hitler read them often. Although he criticized some newspapers, he paid attention to the aggressive styles they used to persuade. Later on, he would use those methods for his own propaganda. Thus, he began constructing the image of the dangerous Jew. It was not an emotional reaction, but an idea that took shape out of personal frustrations, poverty, anti-Semitic texts, and figures like Lueger and Schönerer. By the time he left for Munich, he already had a distorted vision where Jews occupied the central place as enemies of everything he considered false or corrupt. On the streets of Vienna, rejection of the Jews did not come only from politicians. The walls displayed posters, flyers, and advertisements with offensive images that portrayed them as greedy or deformed. In bookstores, pamphlets and books were sold that disguised the attacks as serious studies. Many texts, read by ordinary citizens and by Hitler, claimed that the Jews were not part of the country, but a threat that weakened the German people from within. Without money for a formal education, Hitler spent many hours in public libraries. He read books that combined history, nationalism and racism in a supposedly scientific tone. One of the authors he read most frequently was Lanz von Liebenfels, who claimed that the Jews were an inferior race and a biological danger. These ideas captivated him because they offered simple answers to complex problems. Everything was the Jews' fault. As his economic situation worsened, Hitler began to merge his personal frustrations with what he read. The rejection by the Academy, the cold treatment he received, and the feeling of being excluded fit perfectly with the narrative that blamed the Jews for holding back the true Germans. Although there is no evidence that he had direct problems with Jews at that stage, there are signs that over time he fully adopted the idea that there was a silent conspiracy preventing the advancement of his people. The environment in which he moved reinforced that change. In shelters for the homeless, conversations revolved around blaming the Jews for unemployment, inflation, and moral decay. These statements were repeated without question. In that space, anti-Semitism was not debated, it was assumed as normal. The city itself accompanied that process. Vienna had areas where different cultures coexisted, and others where visible tensions existed. The newspapers portrayed those differences as if they were inevitable conflicts. Hitler did not need to seek out those ideas. They were everywhere. On every corner he found a conversation, a poster, or a speech that reinforced the image of the Jew as a threat. Despite all this, there is no sign that during that period Hitler publicly expressed extreme views. In his writings and in accounts of those who knew him, he does not appear as someone politically active, but rather as a young man locked in his ideas without a clear direction. What is certain is that during those years, the foundation of the ideology he would later adopt and promote violently was being formed. When he wrote Mein Kampf, Hitler turned many of the ideas he had gathered in Vienna into a system. What had once been a vague rejection, fueled by pamphlets and street speeches, became an ideology with the appearance of history and politics. But the time in Vienna was decisive. There he found the pieces he would later use to justify the persecution and elimination of the Jews. By the time he left for Munich, he was no longer the young man who dreamed of painting. In Vienna, he had collected the ideas that distorted his worldview and that would shape his path in politics. Mein Kampf, the manual where he turned his hatred into a political program. In the pages of Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler organized the scattered anti-Semitism he had absorbed in Vienna into a complete discourse, written as a warning to the Germans. Drafted during his imprisonment, it was not an improvised book, but a clear exposition of his worldview. At the center of the text, Judaism does not appear as a religion or a minority, but as a continuous threat to civilization. From the beginning, he links the Jew to Marxism. For him, communism was not just a political idea, but a tool used by the Jews to break nations. He claims that Marxist thought, with its message of equality and its rejection of national pride, sought to weaken the soul of the German people. Bolshevism, in that narrative, was a disguise to conceal Jewish control and promote the collapse of states. But Hitler did not stop there. He also asserted that the Jews were behind the global capitalist system. In this way, he portrayed them as promoters of both communism and economic liberalism, manipulating both sides of politics to wear down Germany. The book insists that the Jews controlled the media, especially newspapers. According to him, they used the press to shape public opinion, interfere in education, and steer culture toward their interests. In several sections, he states that it was no coincidence that the main German newspapers had Jewish owners. For him, that influence served to attack traditions, discredit the army, encourage pacifism, and spread internationalist ideas. He also blames the Jews for having damaged art, music, and design. He accuses them of deliberately ruining German aesthetics with the intention of erasing the country's cultural value. He claims that modern exhibitions, provocative works, and formless music were part of a plan to break the national spirit. In his view, that distorted art was not accidental, but the result of an organized action coming from Jewish influence. Another key part of the text is his assertion that Jews were not creators. According to him, they were imitators who lived off the efforts of others. He said they entered hard-working peoples and weakened them from within. This idea, presented as if it were history, served as a basis to later justify exclusionary measures. By portraying them as outsiders who exploited others, he eliminated any possibility of integration. One of the most well-known phrases from the book makes his intention clear. If the Jew succeeds in dominating the peoples of the earth, his reward will be the total destruction of humanity. With that line, Hitler declares that the existence of the Jews was incompatible with the continuity of the peoples he considered pure. That idea left no room for agreements or mixture. It only envisioned direct conflict. After defining his vision of the battle of ideas, Hitler uses the book to state that the Jew had to be eliminated, not simply limited. Throughout the text, he repeats that protecting Germany was only possible if that threat was eradicated at the root. He says that any attempt at coexistence was doomed to fail, and that history showed what happened when the problem was not confronted with firmness. He linked the advance of Judaism to the ruin of great empires. He claimed that Rome fell for allowing the loss of identity, and that the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed for not preserving its essence. In his view, the Jews knew how to camouflage themselves, adapt to dominant cultures, and weaken them from within. That supposed ability, according to him, was their most dangerous weapon. The book insists that Judaism was not a religion, but a group with hidden objectives. Hitler rejected the possibility that a person could be considered German if they had Jewish origins, even if they were born in the country or were Christian. In his logic, blood defined everything, and any mixture was seen as irreversible damage to the body of the people. This excluded millions, leaving no possibility of belonging. He also said that the Jews used democracies as a refuge. According to his text, the values of freedom, equality, and rights only served for Jews to protect themselves legally within the societies they wanted to control. This served Hitler to reject the entire parliamentary system, which he accused of being manipulated by interests foreign to the majority. In this way, he defended the need for an authoritarian and nationalist model. In his theory, Judaism was a force that harmed all areas. From the economy to education, from the media to universities, everything was under suspicion. Hitler did not seek proof. He repeated phrases, convinced that saying them many times was enough. Thus, propaganda became an essential piece of his project to impose a single way of thinking. In another part of the book, he claims that if the Jew was not stopped, he would end up destroying Germany. In that worldview, there was no room to stay on the sidelines. Whoever did not oppose was helping. This logic divided the population between patriots and traitors, between the awakened and the enemy's allies. Under that framework, elimination was not a crime, it was a necessity. He also said that the country's direction would depend on whether the people were able to detect and stop that threat. He presented that task as a national duty where sacrifice was part of the path. On several pages, Hitler speaks of blood, land, and destiny, combining those elements to build a narrative in which political struggle becomes a battle for continued existence. At no point in the book are gas chambers or mass exterminations mentioned, but the path was already defined. The dehumanization of the Jew, their portrayal as a constant threat, the total rejection of integration, and the idea that their mere presence was incompatible with German life, formed a foundation that allowed for any future decision. Mein Kampf not only conveys hatred, but offers a structure to turn that hatred into official policy. It is a text that blends resentment, distorted ideas, and propaganda, written with the aim of influencing, not debating. With that book, Hitler ceased to be a fringe figure with radical theories and became a leader with a direct purpose: to erase the Jews from Europe as part of the state's plan. How Nazism turned culture into a weapon against the Jews. In the years leading up to the rise of the Nazi government, a propagandistic image gained strength that portrayed the Jews as responsible for a supposed moral decline affecting Germany. In that narrative, parliamentary democracy, the rise of modern art and social changes were seen as signs of an orchestrated disorder. For party spokespersons, the Jews were not merely a minority, but the agents of a transformation that altered the country's customs, traditional values, and national identity. One of the core elements of that narrative was the accusation that Jews promoted deviant sexual behavior, excess, and moral decay. In speeches and writings, party leaders claimed that behind prostitution, provocative cinema, and literature they labeled indecent were Jewish interests. This image was used to explain the unease experienced during the Weimar Republic, a period marked by a freedom many citizens viewed as dangerous. In the same context, modern art was also targeted. It was said that Expressionism, experimental theatre and other movements were the result of a Jewish intervention aimed at destroying the German soul. Later, in exhibitions sponsored by the regime, such works were displayed as degenerate art, not only because of their style, but also due to the supposed racial origin of their creators. The figure of the Jew as the cause of disorder was also extended to the family sphere. Jewish thinkers were accused of encouraging sexual liberation, the rise of feminism, and the dissolution of traditional roles. According to that version, the objective was to weaken the German home, which the party considered the pillar of the nation. In that logic, any alteration of the family model was presented as part of a deliberate plan to break the unity of the country. Within that same discourse, the media was viewed as a key tool of influence. It was claimed that the main newspapers and magazines were run by Jews, and that from there they spread ideas that confused the population, eroded values, and normalized behaviors that had previously been rejected. For the party, this was not pluralism, but a Jewish campaign to dismantle the national essence from within. Cinema was especially targeted. It was said that foreign films, particularly American ones, showed provocative scenes and interracial relationships with the intention of preparing audiences to accept decadence. According to that narrative, behind those productions was always the interest of Jewish producers using cinema to influence the youth. This perception laid the groundwork for future censorship measures. One of the most frequently repeated accusations was the alleged link between Judaism and homosexuality. It was said that Jews spread homosexuality as a way to hinder the growth of the Aryan population. This claim, with no real basis, was repeated in speeches, pamphlets, and official publications. Thus, the image of the Jew was being shaped not only as a political or economic rival, but also as a biological danger threatening the survival of the German leaders, especially figures like Joseph Goebbels, relentlessly disseminated these ideas. Goebbels, in his role in propaganda, focused on spreading narratives that linked artistic decadence to Jewish interests. These claims were not isolated incidents. They were part of a communication strategy aimed at unifying rejection of the Jews from every possible angle: culture, economy, politics, and morality. To achieve that, the regime needed to construct an image in which the Jew embodied all negative elements, from inflation to prostitution, from newspapers to works of art. This combination served to justify the measures that would later be implemented as part of a comprehensive purge. The Nazi Party built a figure in which the Jew appeared as responsible for a supposed widespread moral crisis. That figure was not supported by data, but by the constant repetition of messages which were gradually accepted as truth by broader segments of society. Cultural antisemitism was not based on evidence but on shared feelings, vague interpretations and ideas circulating as if they were certainties. One of the most commonly used methods to reinforce that idea was the creation of a specific vocabulary. Words like degenerate, impure, decadent, or corrupter were repeated to label any artistic, social, or sexual expression associated with Jewish figures. That repetition ultimately fused the concept of Jew with everything perceived as a threat to order. This discourse did not remain symbolic. The Nazis used those arguments to remove Jewish individuals from artistic, academic, and professional spaces. They were expelled from cultural institutions under the pretext of protecting the people from foreign ideas. The belief system promoted by the party was presented as the victim of a silent internal attack carried out by elements alien to the nation. As the regime gained strength, the accusations became more elaborate. They began to speak of a cultural revolution planned from within by media, publishing houses and organizations run by Jews. According to that version, education, critical thinking, and diverse perspectives were mere tools in a plan to divide society. Any form of pluralism was branded as an infiltration attempt. In that context, censorship was no longer presented as an excess, but as self-defense. The closure of publications, surveillance of artists and authors, and book burnings were justified with the argument that they were necessary steps to protect the identity of the people. That logic turned repression into a positive act, portraying the state as the guardian of morality against a hidden enemy operating from within under a legal guise. The role of radio and children's stories was essential in planting that image. From the early years, the regime promoted materials that depicted the Jew as a dark, filthy, or mocking figure. It wasn't just aimed at adults. Children grew up seeing images in which Jewishness was associated with ugliness, strangeness, or harm. That cultural preparation later made it easier to accept much more aggressive policies without widespread resistance. All of this led to the Jew ceasing to be seen as a real person. He became an empty figure full of negative labels, concentrating all the traits considered dangerous. He was both the rich man and the communist, the banker and the lazy man, the pornographer and the cultural critic. That permanent contradiction didn't weaken the propaganda, it made it more effective, as it allowed any grievance to be channeled toward the same target. For the Nazi regime, this construction was not only an ideological tool, it was also useful. By offering a clear and direct explanation for the supposed moral and cultural crisis, it directed collective frustration toward a common enemy. This created an identity based on exclusion. The enemy didn't come from outside. It was inside, in newspapers, in theaters, in universities, in new ideas. The fight against it was presented as the only possible way to save the country, the perfect financial enemy. One of the key foundations of the Nazi message was the idea that Jews controlled global money from hidden places. This claim did not come from serious studies, but from speeches and propagandistic papers that linked them to banks, loans, stock markets, and speculation. It was repeatedly said that economic decisions did not come from the market or governments, but from a plan organized by Jewish interests. During the financial collapse in the Weimar Republic, with extreme inflation and thousands unemployed, many people demanded urgent explanations. The Nazi Party offered a direct version. The Jews caused the disaster. According to them, they had manipulated the value of money to profit while the majority became impoverished. That idea appeared in speeches, posters, and articles from media aligned with the regime. This type of anti-Semitism also relied on mistrust toward certain professions. It was repeated that Jews dominated sectors such as medicine, law, banking, and the press. Although they were few, according to the Nazis, they had taken control of key areas. No achievements or effort were mentioned. Everything was explained as the result of secret maneuvers. In party texts, it was taught that Jews produced nothing, only took advantage of others' work. They were described as figures who lived off credit, interest, and commerce without contributing value. That image portrayed them as a burden on the country that needed to be removed. The uncontrolled inflation of the 1920s was used as proof. It was said that while German families lost everything, Jews were buying properties for pennies. In propaganda images, ruined homes were shown beside caricatures of Jewish merchants celebrating. The message was simple: while one suffered, the other profited. Another point of the narrative was that Jews had no homeland. According to the party, they moved money without regard for borders, creating crises from which they would later benefit. This gave rise to the idea of the international Jew, someone with total access to banks, governments, and decisions of war. The agreements signed after the First World War, such as the Treaty of Versailles, were also explained under this logic. It was said that both winners and losers followed the orders of Jewish financial powers. It was even claimed that the world's gold was under their control and that banks followed their decisions. That narrative served as an excuse to close businesses, seize properties, and enforce legal confiscations. It was not just rhetoric, the actions were accompanied by written laws to legitimize the dispossession. The language used by the party's spokespersons was simplistic. No economic details or real data were provided. They spoke of betrayal, greed, and domination. This way of explaining things allowed anyone to repeat the narrative without needing to understand it. The culprit had a face and a name, and any economic hardship was associated with their existence. When Hitler came to power, the myth became law. The first measures against the Jews were not presented as technical adjustments, but as historical justice. It was said that the people were reclaiming what had been lost. Thus began the process of removing them from all economic activity as a preliminary step to something greater. The exclusion began with regulations that distanced them from public employment and official contracts. It then extended into the private sphere. The party promoted boycotts of Jewish shops and businesses. People were urged to stop buying from and hiring them. These actions were portrayed as national defense against an ongoing threat. One of the key moments was the Aryanization. This process consisted of transferring Jewish-owned companies into German hands through forced sales or legal measures. Businesses were valued below their real worth and handed over to regime-friendly entrepreneurs. All of this was justified with new laws that made the dispossession appear as a protective measure. For propaganda purposes, it was presented as returning what belonged to the people. Meanwhile, messages continued to circulate that fueled the image of the speculative Jew. Lists of businesses still under Jewish ownership were published, along with warnings to consumers. Accusations of fraud, deceit, or immoral behavior were fabricated without evidence. Public opinion was fed daily with these narratives to reinforce rejection. Regime-aligned media repeatedly claimed that removing Jews from commerce would lead to overall improvement. It was said that by eliminating the middleman, prices would drop, labor would become fairer, and opportunities would return to the German people. That argument turned systematic expulsion into a promise of prosperity. The campaign also crossed borders. With the annexation of Austria and other territories, the same measures were applied. Businesses were taken over, transfers were forced, and assets were handed to individuals close to the party. All of this was presented as cleansing, not as theft. That stage, beyond marginalizing them, also served as the foundation for what was to come. By stripping them of resources, networks, and any means of legal employment, the next step was made easier. Misery was not a consequence, it was a strategy. By taking everything from them, the path was cleared for their total elimination. In internal documents, Jews were no longer referred to as people, but as a structural problem. Removing them from the economy was seen as a necessary condition for the country's recovery. Propaganda had achieved its goal, transforming a minority into the symbol of disaster, and the next step, the most extreme, was already in place. It only needed to be carried out. Inclusion was never an option. Under the logic of the Nazi government, there was no room for inclusion or coexistence with Jewish people. From the early steps of the movement, it was maintained that no Jew could be part of the German national body, regardless of their behavior, faith, or how many years they had lived in the country. Belonging did not depend on documents, language, or shared values, but solely on racial criteria. During the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th, there were sectors that sought to integrate Jews through education and civic participation. For the regime's leaders, that process did not represent progress but a greater threat. They believed that the assimilated Jew was more dangerous because he could act from within without raising suspicion. For that reason, they completely rejected all proposals that attempted to include Jews on equal terms. Nazi thinking did not accept coexistence because it was based on a racial worldview. From that perspective, social conflicts were not the result of ideas or class differences, but of distinct racial groups competing for the same territory. Therefore, the only possible measure was total separation. One of the most repeated messages was that the assimilated Jew acted as an infiltrator. It was said that he used his appearance as an ordinary citizen to rise within the system, influence culture, politics, and business, and operate from within. This image of the hidden enemy generated a different kind of fear. It wasn't a stranger, it was someone who could be anywhere. On a legal level, this way of thinking was translated into laws that sought to impose definitive boundaries. The Nuremberg laws, signed in the year 1935, clearly defined who was considered Jewish based on family origin. They prohibited marriages between Germans and Jews, banned them from public employment, and annulled their citizenship. The message was clear: no level of assimilation could erase their exclusion. This set of laws was accompanied by a constant propaganda campaign. Media linked to the regime insisted that any association with Jewish people was harmful. Examples were shown of families destroyed by having relationships with Jewish neighbors or colleagues. Films, books, and school materials reinforced the idea that contact led to a loss of values and a weakening of identity. Within that framework, even Jews with patriotic backgrounds were marginalized. It did not matter if they had fought for Germany or were well known in the cultural world. For the regime, such backgrounds held no weight. It was repeated that no merit could compensate for the risk they represented. The Nazi program also sought to cut every social tie that could generate closeness. Friendships and work relationships were seen as obstacles to stricter measures. Therefore, denunciation was encouraged, connections were punished, and distrust was promoted. The goal was to leave the Jewish community without contact, both physically and emotionally. The rejection of inclusion was not a minor detail, but a central piece of the party's ideological framework. It allowed for a permanent division between us and them, even when no visible difference existed. This division reinforced the internal unity of the dominant group and paved the way for persecution policies. The regime not only blocked integration, it also claimed that previous inclusion policies were part of the problem. According to that stance, allowing Jewish participation had weakened the country from within. For Nazi leaders, the danger did not lie in the obvious, but in the hidden, in the Jews' ability to adapt and use that position to exert influence. This approach made the assimilated Jew the main target of the discourse. It was no longer just about the visible merchant or the recent arrival. The true enemy, according to that idea, was the one who spoke German without an accent, dressed like everyone else, and had earned a place in society. That silent presence was presented as proof that the risk was deeper than it seemed. To reinforce that narrative, public campaigns were organized featuring stories of betrayal and deception allegedly committed by assimilated Jews. Official publications recounted cases of mixed marriages or long-standing friendships that, according to the narrative, ended in manipulation or harm. This constant use of fear aimed not only to justify marginalization, but to provoke rejection even among those who had not previously shown hostile attitudes. The policy also extended to people with partial ancestry. Individuals with just one Jewish grandparent were monitored and, in many cases, excluded from official spaces. This stance revealed that the system left no room for exceptions. It was designed to erase all Jewish presence, even if minimal. The effects of these measures were seen in every area. Young people expelled from schools, professors removed from their posts, doctors denied the right to work, lawyers unregistered, musicians banned. Each case was presented as part of a national renewal, as if the exclusion of a minority were a moral cleansing. Society gradually adapted to this model of systematic separation. The total denial of integration was not limited to ideology. It was enforced through concrete regulations. Public spaces were segregated, identity documents were marked by family origin, and job postings included clarifications such as "Jews not accepted." These types of rules resembled a colonial system, where citizens were created with reduced rights. But in this case, not even that was contemplated. The plan was not to subordinate them, it was to eliminate them entirely. Over time, this policy became even stricter. It was no longer just about forbidding participation, but about erasing their existence. In many neighborhoods, synagogues were shut down, community schools were eliminated, and Jewish organizations were dissolved. Isolation became the rule, and invisibility was presented as the necessary step before more definitive decisions. Internal reports spoke of racial purification as a goal achievable only by preventing all forms of coexistence. This language was not symbolic. It was part of a detailed plan that began with the severing of social ties, continued with labor exclusion, and ended in deportations and executions. The rejection of inclusion was not an occasional tactic. It was part of the overall scheme of elimination. For the regime, allowing Jews to remain in the country, even in a limited capacity, contradicted its entire vision. Every shared space was considered a risk. That is why no middle ground was admitted. The response was singular: cut every tie, close every path, and push an entire group outside the national map. Thus, the step toward elimination no longer appeared as a rupture, but as a logical continuation. Discarded territories, the first trials of Jewish expulsion in Europe. Before mass killings were implemented, the Nazi apparatus went through a phase of proposals aimed at removing the Jewish population from the continent. These initiatives did not emerge from humanitarian intentions, but as attempts to clear the territory the regime sought to reserve exclusively for Germans. From that perspective, physical expulsion was seen as the initial way to address what they called the Jewish problem. One of the most developed plans was the proposal to send the Jews to Madagascar. This option was considered after France was defeated in the year 1940, since the island was part of its colonial structure. For the Nazi officials, it was a distant, isolated place with a harsh climate and no possibility of return. The plan included the maritime transport of millions of people under strict control. The intended conditions were deliberately harsh. It was not a matter of relocation or resettlement, but of creating a covert form of collective punishment. In official documents, it was acknowledged that a large portion of the deportees would die during the journey or shortly afterward due to disease, food shortages, and lack of assistance. These deaths were accepted as part of the expected outcome. The design of the plan included specific calculations: number of ships, number of people to be displaced per year, and the infrastructure required at the new destination. It was stipulated that the deportees would have no contact with the outside world and would remain completely isolated. The goal was not to allow them to establish themselves or build a functioning community. Everything was designed to keep them under control in extreme conditions. Despite the level of detail, the project was never carried out. Operational difficulties were numerous, and British presence along the Indian Ocean shipping routes made it impossible to implement. As the months passed, the plan lost momentum. By late 1940, those in charge began to accept that this option was no longer viable. In parallel, other ideas were considered. Among them was the idea of concentrating Jews in eastern sectors, especially in areas of Poland, and later in regions taken from the Soviet Union. These places were envisioned as confinement zones, guarded by armed personnel. The expectation was that, even without direct measures, the population would be reduced by the conditions themselves. In official documents, the word elimination was not used, but actions implying death were detailed: extreme rationing, exhausting labor, untreated diseases, and sub-zero temperatures. Bureaucracy concealed the real impact behind technical language. Another declared goal was to make Jews disappear completely from the European environment. It was not just about removing them from Germany, but about erasing them from the entire territorial presence. In internal meetings, terms like liberating Europe and leaving the continent clean were used. This expression framed Jews as a physical obstacle that needed to be eliminated. Discussions around these transfers were marked by a conflict between what was desired and what was feasible. Many within the regime wanted a Europe without Jews, but could not find a practical way to achieve that without direct violence. That frustration was one of the factors that pushed the shift toward more extreme options. The transition to more violent methods did not happen overnight. Until the middle of the year 1941, some high-ranking officials were still proposing a reservation for Jews in the east. It was meant to be a closed area where deportees from Germany and from militarily occupied zones would be placed. Reports on that territory explained there would be no sufficient resources or structure to support so many people. Malnutrition, epidemics, and the climate were seen as the tools that would reduce the population over time. Although organized killings were not mentioned, the documents assumed the outcome would be lethal. One of the most frequently mentioned destinations was the Lublin area, within the Polish territory under German control. Thousands of people from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia were expected to be settled there. In that region, improvised detention centers already existed under the control of the SS. The plan included expanding those facilities, erecting fences, and establishing work zones under supervision. The use of interior Soviet regions was also being considered to extend the displacement policy. Remote areas such as Siberia and other eastern regions were mentioned. Due to their climate and remoteness, they were deemed suitable for erasing the Jewish presence without the need for open executions. These proposals were reviewed in operational meetings, where topics such as railway routes, number of people per week, and measures to prevent any contact with local populations were discussed. Every detail was treated as a logistical issue. Limitations increased when transport lines became saturated, and the military required all resources for the Eastern Campaign. The military offensive against the Soviet Union, launched in June of 1941, completely changed the priorities. Trains were needed to move troops and supplies, leaving mass relocations without the necessary means. Despite this, the first deportation tests began. Small groups were sent eastward in inhumane conditions, and many died before arrival. Field reports recorded these deaths as inevitable consequences. The officials made no comments. These experiences revealed the real limits of territorial solutions, although they still did not indicate what the next step would be. The collapse of logistics, the lack of adequate infrastructure, and the impossibility of large-scale isolation marked the end of these attempts. What came next would follow a different kind of strategy, much more direct and with different methods. Coordinated start, when the regime set the extermination in motion. In the early years under Nazi rule, the measures applied against Jews consisted of excluding them from public life and employment, with increasingly harsh regulations. But as the war progressed, that pressure began to seem insufficient to the top leadership. Among those in power, the idea grew that a new step had to be taken, to stop isolating Jews and begin eliminating them with no possibility of return. That shift accelerated after the launch of the military offensive against the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. That operation was not seen as a mere military campaign, but as a total political task. For the Nazi leaders, communism and Judaism represented the same enemy front. In that context, special squads were deployed to execute Jews in the occupied territories. It was the first time a continuous operation of direct elimination was carried out. Reports sent from the east detailed massacres in villages, rural roads and countryside areas. The brigades called Einsatzgruppen operated alongside regular soldiers and with the help of local civilians. Although there was no signed document ordering the extermination of the entire Jewish population, the actions already showed that this was the direction taken. Mass shootings became part of daily practice. Inside regime offices, meetings between heads of different departments became more frequent. Officials responsible for trains, security, civil records and public administration began working together. These discussions focused on numbers, transfers and more efficient methods. Open language was avoided. Instead of kill, phrases like necessary measures or special procedures were used. Reinhard Heydrich was assigned to coordinate these tasks. His role was to align all sectors of the state under a single goal. Although the Wannsee Conference would occur later, many of the decisions were already in motion. It was not a policy defined by a single order, but the result of many interconnected steps. The urgency to find faster and more discreet methods grew. Executions by shooting were seen as slow, emotionally burdensome for those who carried them out, and left traces. For that reason, other methods were studied, ones that could operate more quickly and with less exposure. At the same time, plans were made to build facilities with a single purpose: to eliminate people. These were no longer ordinary prisoner camps. They were conceived from the start as places designed to execute and erase without leaving evidence. Everything was organized as a technical operation. Schedules, routes, resources and materials were defined as part of a transportation network. At that point, the state system functioned as an assembled mechanism. The SS, official departments, regional governments and transportation companies acted as parts of the same structure. Each area had clear functions, from detention to final implementation. That cooperation occurred without the need for explicit orders. Meanwhile, propaganda maintained its central role. The idea of the infiltrated enemy, of hidden threats, and of dangers operating from within was constantly repeated. The goal was to make the population accept the transfers and disappearances without demanding explanations. Public messages reinforced the urgency of acting firmly to protect common security. By the end of the year 1941, the plan was already defined. Massacres on the Eastern Front continued, while the first sites built exclusively for executions were being prepared. The intention to physically erase the Jews was no longer a political slogan. It had become a functioning system in the process of expansion. The operation required a stable structure and involvement from multiple areas. Internal procedures were drawn up, tasks were assigned, and rules were set. Although a single unified written instruction still did not exist, all participants understood the intended outcome. It was no longer about removing or confining them. The purpose was to make them disappear completely. In January of 1942, the Wannsee Conference was held. At that meeting, key regime figures discussed the administrative steps to carry out the so-called final solution. Although the machinery was already in motion, the meeting served to organize each sector's responsibilities. Each delegate received clear missions. No one raised objections. Everything was explained in technical terms. From that moment on, extermination became the central focus of regime decisions. The annihilation of entire groups became routine, carried out with total control and without interruption. The course was set to erase all Jews from the European map, without leaving traces, without exceptions, and without witnesses. The death machine, how the mass execution centers operated. The Nazi regime's execution complexes did not operate as mere elimination sites. They were structured to implement, step by step, the racial vision promoted by those in power. From the arrival of trains to the total disposal of bodies, everything followed a logic that transformed doctrine into procedure. The idea of the biological enemy became an organized chain that eliminated any possibility of escape or humane treatment. Upon descending from the wagons, the newly arrived received no clear explanations. Many believed it was just another stage on the way to a labor site. That confusion was essential. It allowed for control and prevented uprisings. On the platforms, officers quickly assigned those deemed fit for forced labor, while the rest were led without warning to areas of immediate death. That selection lasted only a few minutes. There was no dialogue or reasoning. Women with children, the elderly, the ill, or anyone who didn't appear useful, was sent directly to their end. The criterion was not what someone had done, but what they could provide. Those deemed unfit for labor were eliminated without further procedure. Those assigned to work were locked in overcrowded barracks, with little food and constant surveillance. Daily punishment and the harsh physical conditions wore them down within days. The goal was to extract all possible effort before replacing them. Prisoners were told they would take a shower. They left their clothes and belongings with the promise they would retrieve them. That lie was part of the system. Once inside the chamber, the doors were sealed airtight. The gas took minutes to act. Screams, banging, and desperation could be heard. No one came out. Then, forced groups, the so-called Sonderkommandos, had to remove the bodies, cut hair, extract gold teeth, and carry the remains to the ovens. These groups knew they too would be eliminated, to ensure no witnesses remained. The procedure killed and erased its own traces. The camp space was divided into sections. No group saw the full process. Each carried out fragmented tasks. Assignments rotated. Orders were given in technical language. That division allowed many to claim ignorance of the full extent of what was happening. However, the way everything was designed made it clear that the goal was known to all. These were not improvised facilities. They had internal railways, chambers and ovens with calculated capacity and fine-tuned details aimed at greater efficiency. Various gases were tested, zones were redesigned, routines were accelerated. Each adjustment aimed to increase the daily death count. That model was replicated in multiple locations. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other camps operated under the same logic. Geographic isolation and local control helped maintain secrecy. Millions were murdered there without record or trial. A key element of the operation was normalization. Mass execution was treated as a regular task. There were set schedules, expected volumes, items to collect. Management turned each crime into a data point. Every arriving group was registered. Lists were made to determine who would work and who would die. These lists were sent to central offices, where numbers were compiled. Names were replaced by totals. Individuals were reduced to numbers. SS personnel received special training. They were taught that Jews were not part of society, but an element that needed to disappear. That dehumanization was reinforced through speeches, publications, and daily activities. Among themselves, vague expressions were used. They spoke of processing, relocation, management. This helped them avoid emotional involvement. Alcohol consumption was encouraged, and incentives were offered to those who maintained performance. New methods were tested in certain camps. Airtight trucks, different gases, even explosives. Not all worked well, but they showed a constant effort to optimize the system. Victims were forced to perform tasks such as unloading trains, cleaning chambers, moving corpses. This not only worsened their suffering, but also allowed for fewer agents to be directly involved. Each area of the camp had a specific function: disinfection zones, storage rooms, barracks, ovens, administrative offices. Every sector operated with a clear purpose. There was no room for disorder. The implementation of this doctrine allowed no exceptions. Neither prior merit, personal relationships, nor any history offered protection. The racial logic prevailed in every case. There were no nuances. When the military defeat of the regime became imminent, the system did not slow down. Documents were destroyed, traces covered up, but the executions continued. Until the very end, the goal was to complete the total extermination. What happened was neither an accident nor improvisation. It was the calculated execution of a doctrine that, from the beginning, had promised to eradicate an entire group. The camps turned that promise into direct action, carried out with cold precision, order, and a structure that made crime into a daily task. when looking away was a choice, what was seen and silenced in Germany. During the years of the systematic extermination of the Jews, a large portion of German society had some level of exposure to what was happening. Although the government tightly controlled official news, many citizens heard versions, noticed signs, or received indirect comments. In many cases, silence was a deliberate choice made to avoid confronting something uncomfortable. The evictions and displacements of entire groups were visible. Homes were left empty after the operations. It was said to be due to relocations, but that explanation stopped making sense over time. No one returned, and the letters stopped arriving. Train workers and military personnel shared comments. People spoke of locations where individuals disappeared, of convoys with no return, of buildings with continuous smoke. These stories circulated without any official version, but they caused unease. Some paid attention, others chose to ignore it. Talking about these topics in public carried risks. Suspecting too much could be dangerous. Even so, the signs were everywhere. Cut-off letters, places never mentioned in the press, photos that slipped through censorship. Intuition mixed with concrete facts. In cities, rumors were passed quietly. Names like Auschwitz or Treblinka were spoken with caution. Though many didn't know the exact details, it was understood that no one came back from those places. Conversations were brief and often ended with evasions or silence. Large companies did not question where the workers came from or where the goods were going. The economic aspect was central. Religious organizations, with few exceptions, did not speak out publicly. Most institutional structures preferred to stay out of the issue. In towns and remote areas, proximity made it harder to ignore. Trains full of people were seen, screams were heard from the wagons, and certain locations were used as transit centers before deportation. It was difficult not to notice. Some soldiers returned with photos or stories. In private gatherings, they showed those images or described disturbing scenes. For some, it was a warning. For others, just another story from the front. In factories, those working near forced laborers saw their physical deterioration, heard unfamiliar languages, and noticed constant surveillance. It was clear they were not there by choice. Though few had the full picture, many assembled fragments. That partial understanding, combined with fear, led to an attitude of not wanting to know more. Learning more could have consequences. Silence also served as a form of self-protection. Expulsions were presented as procedures. They were announced as orderly operations, justified by regulations. That formal appearance softened the moral impact. Phrases like resettlement or security action were used to conceal the systematic extermination. Propaganda sustained the narrative. Ideas linking Jews to disease, deception, or crime were repeated constantly. This insistence created a distorted image that made it easier not to react. In this way, the disappearance of people was not seen as injustice, but as a measure to maintain order. In the occupied eastern territories, those who returned spoke of disturbing things. There was talk of trenches, shootings, or strange buildings. Some recounted it coldly, others with discomfort. These stories never appeared in the press but fueled suspicion in various circles. Trains passed through familiar cities. Sealed wagons, armed guards, people in visibly poor condition were clear signs. Those who operated the trains knew, and so did those who saw houses emptied or shops reassigned without explanation. There were also individuals who intervened. Some helped the persecuted or refused to participate, but they were few, and punishment was swift. The system was designed to eliminate any attempt at assistance. In schools and neighborhoods, children asked about missing classmates. The answers were vague or simply repeated the official version. That omission also taught others not to speak. When Nazi military power began to collapse, an attempt was made to erase all evidence. Archives were burned, documents destroyed, and prisoners forced to eliminate traces. Some Germans witnessed these final actions without asking questions. When Allied forces opened the camps, the images were impossible to deny. Photos, recordings, and testimonies revealed what had previously been avoided or silenced. Many citizens claimed they knew nothing. They said they had been misinformed or had never imagined such a level of crime. But the clues, rumors, and signs were many. The question was not whether they knew, but whether they wanted to know. Denial was also part of the same silence as before. Responses after the conflict varied. Some denied it entirely. Others said it wasn't that serious. A few acknowledged what had happened, but most chose not to look back. The extermination was not only the work of those who carried it out, but also of those who allowed it through their lack of action. From the first exclusions to complete disappearance, every step followed an order that no one interrupted. The laws marked the beginning, the transports filled the trains, and the camps did the rest. Everything was carried out with precise methods, leaving no room for chance, with officers stamping papers while others watched the platforms. What once seemed temporary became permanent, and what began with words took shape through structures designed to erase millions without leaving a trace. The routes were mapped out, names were replaced by numbers, and death became part of the routine without raising questions. Those nearby saw it firsthand, those farther away pieced together fragments, and those who participated did so through assigned tasks. No one needed to know everything to understand what was happening. By the time the end came, there was no one left who could tell the story from within, but everything had already been recorded in the way the system had operated from the very first day.